Hello, everyone. You all could take your seats, please. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. My name is Honesty Gant, and I serve currently as the Public Affairs Chair for Student Activities Council. I want to thank you guys for coming out this afternoon and coming out to the many public affairs events this week. Today, I will be introducing Dr. Majora Carter. She is an urban revitalization consultant, a real estate developer, and award-winning broadcaster. She has redefined the field of environmental equality in the South Bronx to alleviate the pressures of poverty and climate change. I do want to let you know to keep in mind that we will be doing a question and answers. That is what the papers are for. But if you could please wait until that moment comes and wait for the microphones to ask your questions, that would be wonderful. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Majora Carter. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Hello, everybody. So I'm bringing you greetings from the Boogie Down. That is, let's see, ghetto parlance for the South Bronx in New York City. So there you go, birthplace of hip hop. So how y'all doing? Anywho, so I'm really happy to be here. And so I know that a lot of the conference has been about issues around sustainability, and I'm going to sort of broaden that idea of what sustainability is in terms of real estate development and how our communities are essentially planned, like what makes a sustainable community. And I'll tell you what it isn't in many ways, and then our approach to how we've created and why we've come to the conclusion that why we decided to take the approach that we do right now. And so the kind of South Bronx that I grew up in New York City, and it was the very different from the kind that my dad moved into back in the late 1940s when he came up from Americus, Georgia, in pursuit of his great American dream. But around the 60s and 70s, there was white flight. There was a financial disinvestment that literally had landlords torching their buildings to collect insurance, in order to collect insurance money, because there wasn't any real opportunity for folks in that area to actually get things like bank loans, or the kind of grants or business development loans to help to support those communities. So we got to see, and in my youth, starting from the time I was about 6 or so, literally got to see these tracts of land that look like this. So again, financial disinvestment, kind of what it did do was the businesses that were in the communities obviously couldn't be there anymore. We lost about 60% of the Bronx's as a whole population from in the 1970s and 80s, and we're literally just getting back to the point where we are almost back to where we were and beyond it as well. But the financial disinvestment paved the way for what was this formerly walk-to-work community to then become home to these things that were not particularly things that helped people build financial equity and development. So they were not the kind of jobs that really supported people, but it was the kind of economic disinvestment that created more environmental disturbances within our communities. So these were the kind of businesses, and they were businesses, that came into the community, but it also had a health effect on the people that were in our communities, from the waste to the power plants to the types of diesel truck traffic, you name it, we had it. All in that one little area. So by the time I was growing up, it was literally this big. All the smart kids in the community were being told that if they were going to grow up and be somebody, they literally had to do it outside of the community. Like, we were taught that we had to, we needed to measure success by how far we got away from our communities. And education was our way out of the neighborhood. And so I took that to heart, literally from the time I was 7. My brother was actually killed as a result of gun violence in the community. I definitely saw people, fall in terms of, the kind of abuse, that drug and alcohol abuse that happened in the community. And I watched other people just leave because no one wanted to be there. And so, of course, I was like, I'm out of here. But what was interesting about that was that I used education to get out, and then, the forces of the universe, God, was just like, no, honey, you're going back home. And I went home because I needed a cheap place to stay when I went to graduate school. And what's cheaper than mommy or daddy's spare room? Not too many places. So that's where I stayed when I went to New York University. But it was around that same time that I also started to understand a few things, and maybe it was because there was education and distance that allowed me to see my community not just as what was sitting in front of me, but as the sort of historic inequities that were happening, that were actually placed upon it, because it happened to be politically vulnerable. That's around the time when I realized that our city was planning on, that our city and our state was planning on building another huge waste facility on our waterfront. And that's when I thought, okay, this is only happening because we happen to be a very poor community of color and thus politically vulnerable. And that's when I felt, okay, now, and I can pretend I don't know this, or, because, I had a bunch of letters behind my name already, and I could have gone off and no one would have blamed me, if I decided to do that kind of stuff and rather prolong my career in some other aspect. But instead, I decided to stay and be a part of the community's resistance to these very discriminatory solid waste management policies. But at the same time, I realized, I was an artist, and that's literally what I had my training in, I didn't want to just be fighting against something. And I also knew that people in my community wanted to fight for something as well. And that's when I kept getting these notices and meetings from these folks who worked with the U.S. Forest Service that were literally going around giving these little $10,000 seed grants to folks that wanted to do restoration projects for threatened rivers in urban areas in America. And I was like, okay, that's nice and obviously a good project, but what does that mean for us? I mean, we have a river. I knew we had this thing called the Bronx River because there was literally a parkway named after it. You saw it on a subway map, but I'd never actually seen it. Come to find out, it was actually 6 blocks away from my house, behind, a huge amount of things like concrete facilities, and ways that literally separated an industry that separated the people from the community from the waterfront. So we didn't know it was there or we had access to it. But then I had this crazy dog that literally pulled me into what I thought was just another dump in the neighborhood. Turns out that dump did dead end at the Bronx River. And that's when I realized, oh, I could actually apply for that little grant. And so applying for it literally gave us the opportunity to buy lunch for folks that volunteered to do it, paid a tiny, but my salary was also very tiny, so it actually covered a bit of the work so that I could go out and do the work and get partners to help us, get all the equipment so that we can pull stuff like this out of the spot as well. And it really helped us build alliances so that we could transform it, from that dump into this version that was there. But then we also realized we had to do more, because even though people were really clear that they wanted to have a nicer, better community, what we didn't have was a community that had actually experienced it firsthand in their own neighborhood. They were used to leaving the neighborhood in order to experiencing anything nice. So unless you were like an old friend of mine who really liked rollerblading all by himself and didn't want other people around, what we realized we had to do was bring people in order to, to create the kind of programming that folks would want to participate in our own community. So there was boat building programs and environmental stewardship programs. We had way more events than I wish I'd organized myself. But it was just a way to get people out onto the space and recognize that they actually had a waterfront, a really amazing river in their own community. And again, the first time people had even thought about it. Now, this is one of my favorite pictures in the world, because as you can see, I'm just posing because I had spent 7 years working on this, and I was just ready for my close-up. I'm going to be straight up. And the mayor and the parks commissioner are like working hard. I'm like, dude, I already did your work. Thank you very much. Now give me my $3 million so that we can get this thing fixed. And that's exactly what we were celebrating that day. So it went from the dump to this beta version to this, which is the Hunts Point Riverside Park as it exists right now. And it's the kind of place that really has become this gathering spot for the community, and also a really beautiful way for the neighborhood, for the people in the community to have a piece of land that literally reflects beauty right back onto them. And I got married there back in 2006. This is, what year is this? 2018. Oh my gosh, it's going to be 12 years. Good Lord. But anyway, Yeah, so that's the dog, my dog that pulled me into the dump. She was my flower girl. And so just to have something like this in a community, where we were generally taught that nothing good could come from it is a really incredible thing. And we are actually also now a national award-winning park. We actually beat out Millennial Park in Chicago for an award for excellence in design in an urban area. So I'm really psyched about that too. I love Chicago, but whatever. But what's interesting is that when people think about community development especially in low-status communities, they'll talk about neighborhood preservation, and it's almost as if, what they're preserving is the poverty that exists in those type of places, and almost as if it's because it's so associated with it that poverty is almost this cultural attribute, not like something that is a temporal position for people living in this world. But it's kind of like if you're born poor, you stay poor. It's like we don't live in a caste system in America, even though sometimes that's the way it works out. Like you're born into a class and you stay there. But it doesn't have to be that way. But that is the way it's actually treated, and that goes across color lines as well. So, but it's sort of because when we looked at the kind of things that we saw, and we did huge amounts of surveys. We did focus groups, just asking people in the local community, what kind of community did they want to be in? Literally, what were their hopes and dreams and aspirations? And what was really interesting was the kind of on the don't want side were all the things that you often find in America's low status communities. And the things they wanted were the kind of things that anybody would want in their own community, middle class or above. And so we were just like, so is poverty a cultural attribute, or do we apply that attribute to low status communities? And it made me also think about, if you were trying to build a company, and if you know that in order to build a company, you have to have great talent, you do what you need to do to retain that talent. But we don't do that in America's low-status communities. As a matter of fact, we assume that, we tell the bright, hardworking kids in our communities that, they should measure success by how far they get away from those communities. We don't try to retain the talent in those neighborhoods. And so by doing that, we're not acting the same way that a company would in terms of retaining talent that's in it. But I was like, how about if we treat communities the same way as corporations treat their companies? Would we want to make that company a great place for people to want to be associated with it? Or would we repel them, knowing that it would actually cost more to train up new people to bring them on board afterward? So this is the approach that we're taking now, is really about how do we retain talent in low status communities so that they become the model for investment and reinvestment in their own communities, and that becomes more of a model rather than an exception. So again, these were in terms of what people wanted to see in their own communities, that's what they wanted to see. But what's really interesting is just because people in low status communities don't necessarily see value in their neighborhoods doesn't mean that somebody else from the outside doesn't. These are actual, what do you call them, flyers or pieces of mail that I'd literally get at my house. I own a piece of property in my own neighborhood, and someone is always trying to buy my house for cash. Again, these are predatory speculators that literally prey on low-status communities, and again, they're assuming that the folks in those communities don't understand have the financial savvy to understand that there will be change in their communities. Now, some people will call it gentrification, some people will call it community reinvestment. I don't care what you call it. I really don't. Because what happens is change will happen. And so what we also do know, at this point, is that I think there are two kinds of development that happens in low-status communities, because there really is the typical gentrification model, and then there's also the kind that assume, where those predatory speculators come in, buy up property, and eventually the poor people in the neighborhood are going to be displaced. Okay, that's the typical one. But the other kind, which I think is just as insidious in a bunch of ways, is something we've labeled poverty-level economic maintenance. So instead of in those communities, you find things like you'll find all these kind of healthy food choices, but not like good, decent grocery stores where there's affordable produce and stuff. There's a type of local economic developments that make you wish you had other choices. in your own community, as opposed to like some nasty looking store that you really don't want to go to but have no choice because there's no place else to go. I'm a girl who loves a bargain, but there are $3 stores within our community within a 3-block radius, and it's kind of like, could there be something else? Possibly, because again, people leave the neighborhood in order to experience the quality that they want. And in terms of, there's plenty of places to get, pharmaceutically medicated, which is, the legitimate kind, or the illegitimate kind in some ways, shapes, or forms. You'll find plenty of both of these type of things. And last, and definitely not least, the ability to actually make your money work for you is like, through a credit union or a bank. You won't find many of them in low-status communities, but instead you'll find pawn shops and payday loan places, lots of check cashing stores, all of which charge you for your own money. So that's another interesting kind of dynamic to see. And last, definitely not least, is you'll also find in these same areas lots of very highly subsidized affordable housing. And the idea there is that please don't go around saying Majora Carter hates poor people and thinks affordable housing is terrible. Not true. What I do despise and understand really well is that when you continue to concentrate all of those things that I showed you, all these indications of poverty level economic maintenance, because again, all of these things make money, lots of it, but not necessarily for the communities that they're in. That money does not circulate throughout that economy. It goes in once and it goes out, and that's that. But when you concentrate poverty and you see all of these indicators all connected, what tends to happen is that you also concentrate all the effects of concentrated poverty, from lower academic achievement to higher rates of poor health outcomes, higher rates of incarceration, poverty, and I think even much more insidiously, a lack of hope. Because folks who were born and raised in those communities don't see those places, in many cases, as sites of fruitfulness. Like they see them more of as a place to escape. And the popular American narrative is filled with, born and raised in a really poor, rough and tumble area, but then they moved up and out. And that's that. And so we like to think of the gentrification does not happen when we start seeing, white people in a formerly, community of color, or when something like a doggy daycare moves in. What we know gentrification, when it starts to happen, is when we tell young people that from those communities to measure success by how far they get away from them. If we're not expecting them to create opportunities to reinvest in their own community so that they're the ones actually playing a role in it. When we're exacerbating brain drain, when we're telling those folks that, it's okay, and that we're leaving behind the people that are in those communities because we don't think they're going to prosper in any other way anyway, just trying to make poverty a little more comfortable for them to stay in. And but what was really interesting to us is that, we knew that we weren't the only people who were feeling this way, and that even though all these things have just continued to happen over and over and over again for decades in low-status communities of all colors all over the country. But again, when we asked folks in our communities, what did you think about it, this was the list of things that people felt that they wanted to see more of. They wanted gathering spaces that weren't like the inside of a health clinic or or another community center. Like they wanted to be able to spend time and money in their own community doing things that actually made them feel like they had something going for them. They understood job creation, and that there weren't no one was really looking at the kind of economic drivers that would have produced jobs and created, like, whether they were different kind of economic ecosystems within our communities. And brain drain was real. Like no one wants their kid to grow up everybody wants their kid to grow up and do better than they did, right? And so, but they also wanted to know that their kids could actually have lives, within their own communities that fed them, and that also spoke to the fact that they were more highly educated than their own parents. And so, but there wasn't a whole lot of either jobs or housing to meet with them. And again, they didn't want always like the structures of poverty, which is like lots and lots of community centers and health centers. Because I got to tell you, I have never, ever, ever met a person from a low status community say that they wanted to move to another community just because they had more community centers. They don't do that. They go to places that have like a great nightlife, that feels safe and has cool parks and great bookstores and on all sorts of things to make them feel like their community is something that actually responds to their needs and desires. So that's a little bit different because that, frankly, that does feel good. And so, so this is what our approach was, to really take a look at how could we, in our own capacity as a developer, respond to some of those needs and using this approach, this very social enterprise approach, to help us do what we wanted to see happen in our own community that responded to people's needs as well. And so we actually did a joint venture for a coffee shop, and it was the first coffee shop our community had since I was in high school in the 1980s, 1981, when I was, something like that. But there were no coffee shops. There were no like gathering spaces. So we decided to go into a joint venture with a really great coffee roaster from Manhattan. And, we partnered, to open up this little coffee shop. And then back on Martin Luther King Jr. Day in 2017, we decided to go at it alone. And it became the first 100% locally owned coffee shop in the South Bronx, run by 2 families of color in the community as well. And we changed the name to the Boogie Down Grind Cafe, and we're actually about to open up a second coffee shop as well. So we're super excited about the fact that we, 2 families that together have about 100 years worth of history in the Hunts Point section of the South Bronx, have also opened up this particular coffee shop. We're hiring locally and really helping to create new people's interests, in the specialty coffee as an industry as a whole, as well as creating spaces for us. Again, going back to the whole job creation opportunity. People, the tech world, it's getting bigger by the second. We know that it is. But what was really interesting there is that when you hear many people talk about technology in low status communities, there's almost always the first thing is like, oh, but people need access to the internet. And we already have access to the internet. Actually, we did a study that was then totally corroborated by a huge one that the Pew Research Center did that said that in most low-status communities around the country, people do have access to the internet, and it's specifically through smartphones. Not the most ideal thing, but they have the access. So the digital divide, it's a little more complex than just saying people need access to broadband, because there is a divide, but the real divide is specifically, are you simply a consumer, or are you also a producer? And that is where it goes. The cut is deep and wide. And we know that because if you look at things like diversity, between the tech sector versus American diversity, we actually are a pretty mixed country. But if you look at the tech world, you would think that the country is only white men, because white women aren't doing that great, and definitely people of color aren't either. So it's not. So that's within the thing. It's not that I think that everybody who's in the tech sector is racist or sexist. Believe me, some are, definitely. But for the most part, I think people hire who they know. And if this is a sector that is predominantly white men, then yeah, it's going to be predominantly white men who are going to be hired, unless we can come up with a real smart way, and not just training and praying that people get jobs, in the tech sector, but really come up with a really smart way to make it happen. And so we think we came up with one, which is a way to diversify the tech sector, but also do it in a market-based way that's actually creating real value for not just people who are trained to get work in the tech sector, but also for the tech ecosystem as a whole. And Startup Box is actually a way for low-status communities to be full participants in the tech economy. And the first one that we did, of course, is in the South Bronx. And so our talent base, are people from a broad spectrum, folks who actually are unemployed and didn't have a chance, have really had no jobs, up to people who've spent a good amount of money on their own, on their own education in technology, have computer science or engineering degrees, and have actually done, or other types of training, and have spent the money and done the work. And so we realized that this was our talent base that we were dealing with. And so again, going back to what is this market-based approach and solution to actually getting people to think about what could happen now, we did a couple years of market research and understood that in the software development pipeline, there actually was a little bit of it that used to be the place where people would enter the tech sector and actually get a bit of training and also, but more importantly, networking with other folks so they could get their next job. and it was called quality assurance. And quality assurance is basically software testing. All it is when you think about a writer. They have an editor to check their work. It's the same thing. If you're a software developer, you probably have someone checking your work, and that you to make sure that it's hitting its marks and hitting its audience. But that person, instead of an editor, is a quality assurance analyst. And so that section of the software development pipeline has been offshored a lot in the last 20 years or so. And so but when we did our research, we realized that for some sectors, that was totally fine within the software development pipeline. But for some sectors, it was not. So for folks where there was a lot of heavy, user interface work, a lot of customer-facing stuff going on, that it was not. So games, websites with lots of moving parts, that kind of work when it was offshored, whether it was India, China, Eastern Europe, the fact that it was time zones away, the fact that there was a cultural competency that wasn't being fully engaged, the fact that, that people, once they were here, when they got their product back, because of the first two things, it wasn't quite working the way they wanted it to, we realized, well, maybe if we could add value to the people who are doing some of that work here by actually having their quality assurance work done locally. And so we decided to test the model out, and we created a protocol and hired a few people and literally gave the product away to Nickelodeon and also to a smaller game company called Tresenza. And we did this, and we took their work and did most of it in our office back up in the South Bronx. But then we would also take it to just make sure that we got it right, to their home offices, and just where we'd meet around, and they'd get a chance to talk to our folks about what they were working on. And because of that, we realized we actually had a good product, and because they were really happy with everything that we did, and we realized that we could take the show on the road because our clients actually got a product that was useful for them, and then, of course, our teammates actually got money in their pocket. And even more importantly, they not only got the money as an entry-level job, but they also made connections with our clients who could then be hired away from, and that was also a part of what we wanted to do. We wanted them to be networked to other folks within the tech sector, and that is often the way people get their work. And also, this is just a slide to show that the testing market is actually growing by the billions, which is a really good thing, because that's where we want to make sure we're getting people hired up to do. And so that's when we realized we were ready for the big time, and so we rented these two little storefronts. So I already told you about the cafe. And Startup Box also became its own entity. And so we did that. We wanted it to be on a physical corner within the community because we wanted people to be able to look through the window and see Black and brown people working on technology. And so really change, the paradigm that this is a place of only corner stores and health clinics and liquor stores. But no, this is actually a part of the tech ecosystem within New York City, and their friends and neighbors were actually doing this work as well. So that was a really powerful tool. As a matter of fact, it was so funny because when we first started, actually the first 6 months, our team members had to take turns answering the door because people were coming in and just utterly confused that something like this could happen. So they had to explain to them what quality assurance was and why we were doing it. And it was a really powerful, local education as well for folks. We did gaming tournaments simply as a way to get people involved, as a recruitment tool, which was also really fun. And it really provided a great way for the community to get together. This was the most fun community center anybody'd ever been to. And it was intergenerational, which as I'm not a gamer, so I didn't know that. But again, it was a great way to get people in the door to actively recruit them too. It was also a really interesting way to build bridges within the community. Because this photo was a reference to the relationship that we actually had with police officers in our community, because we would host these gaming tournaments, and it would be 100 people showing up in this little tiny storefront. And so, of course, the cops would come. I mean, it's a Black and brown neighborhood, and there was that relationship. And which was a tension. But what we realized, it was these young cops were actually just kind of looking in the door or coming in, not because they wanted to, be what often many of us think of as cops, but they actually wanted to play. But they were on duty. And then we realized, right after there was Eric Garner, the case of police brutality, and Eric Garner was caught in that chokehold and died as a result of it, illegal chokehold, and died as a result of it. And when the cop that did it was not convicted, people flipped out all over the city. I think actually all over the country, but in the city it was bad. And so we worked with our police precinct as a way to just kind of like get people in the same room. And so what we did was we hosted a Call of Duty gaming tournament. And for those of you that aren't gamers, yes, Call of Duty is a shooter game, but guess what? I have no issue with virtual guns. It's the real ones that I have a problem with. And what happened as a result of that was nothing short of incredible. We didn't know if anybody was going to show up on the cops or the community side. It turns out that both people did. Nobody left until like 2 o'clock in the morning. And we can't claim full credit for any of it, but what I can claim some credit for is knowing that our precinct was the only one in the Bronx that didn't experience a rise in negative community and police interactions. And I think a lot of that had to do with our precinct working really hard to make sure that people understood that they were actually part of a community versus something that was working against it. And it was a really powerful thing, I think, for all of us to actually have witnessed at the time. And we're also planning to take the Startup Bucks model on the road so that we can actually create both direct and indirect jobs, within the country around that. And so now Startup Box is on its own and it's doing quite well. But that same space is now, we've also incubated other businesses in it. And currently, the one that's in it is the South Bronx's first and only boutique fitness studio, which is actually really fun too, called iCycle. This is another, so going back to the kind of things that the community also wanted to see, the kind of third space, gathering spaces, restaurants, bars, and things like that. This was an old rail station that the Amtrak had decided to evict. It wasn't used as a rail station. It was actually a little strip mall, and the guy that owned it was actually a strip club owner. He died. Amtrak evicted all the other tenants that were there, and it was empty for a while, and we decided we needed to have that spot. First, we just made it look a little nicer by having people in it, or rather having a group of young people do a little mural on it, and then we went to work trying to create a more family-friendly space on it. And so it's literally been this is the model for what we're trying to build there, and we're working now. We just got the financing to help create a model there. And we were hoping for is like a local food court so that their individual, local chefs from the Bronx will be able to have their own individual kitchen, and the dining hall will be managed by a larger operator. So that is our hope and dream and possibility. But then there's more, in terms of like the kind of broad scale real estate development that we also want to see happening. So this is a former juvenile detention facility. Actually, my dad was a janitor there in the late 1960s and early 70s, and it's where all of New York City's juvenile defenders would go. And so at its peak, I think it probably housed like 1,500 kids. There's a lot of kids in one space, even if it was 5 acres big. It's like, it was a bad place, like universally known around the country as not the way to handle young people. And I don't care what they did, but it's just, you weren't helping to support them so they wouldn't go out and convict crimes again. But that's another talk. But anyway, so when it finally was closed down for a host of reasons, when children's rights advocates and prison reform advocates really worked to make sure that the city didn't handle kids this way, and so they got them out of there, and it was closed. But that's when I realized that site in and of itself, because of its size, at 5 acres big, it could be this incredible place to show an approach to real estate development where the site was literally used as a catalyst for the type of development that actually could make people feel as though this was a place that where you could use real estate development as a social, environmental, and economically transformational tool, as opposed to just poverty-level economic maintenance or gentrification in a low-status community. And it involved actually doing mixed-income housing and mixed-use commercial development. And so on the housing side, having all of those things was what could be really a great thing. Mixed-income housing, mixed-use commercial development, having the types of housing for different levels of affordability for different types of people. Because, there's, yes, the kids aging out of foster care. absolutely should have great housing that's mixed into, mixed into a complex, and not just like this little, youth home that makes people feel isolated and alone anyway. But there's also, what about for the families who actually raised kids who went to college and who want to come back home, but actually have, enough money to actually afford a really nice place? Can you actually mix those things together? And we thought we could. Manufacturing and education, looking specifically at what are the economic growth trends, in technology, in manufacturing, around food, and in apparel, and really assembling the kind of spaces so that you can build those models out there. And public space, that is the great democratizer. Excellent open public space that is free for anyone to enjoy, literally has an impact on the way people feel about their environment. And there's huge studies about that, and it's really incredible, so that we wanted to make sure happened too. And commercial and retail, you can tell the economic health of a community by how often a dollar circulates through it. In a very poor community, a dollar goes in and then it goes out to feed somebody else. But in an economically stable community, that same dollar sometimes circulate up to 14 times. Because people are spending money. They're going to the local grocer, they're going to the local shoe shop, which is owned by somebody who lives in that community, who's hiring somebody who also lives there. And it goes on and on and on. But that's not what happens in low status communities. So we wanted to make sure that those smaller retail things were actually also a part of that too. And it's also really interesting because when we looked at that particular site, it had the kind of topography of a lot of post-industrial American cities in terms of the way the land was used. Because there was where it rested right in the middle, in the place that we're calling the hinge. On one side of it was the industrial section. On the other side was the residential area. And so, but then if you look around it, there were assets all around. There was great public transportation. There's this greenway also that I'm working on that was going around the neighborhood as well. But that hinge area, because it's a little weird zoning-wise, and it's where the industrial section and the residential section kind of meets, and so nothing really happens there, except like this is where the jail was on one side, and on the other side is where the industrial section was happening, and so. There was an engine truck rebuilding shop, an illegal chop shop, and and just some old parking lots that actually were not even used. Somebody was land banking them, but really, what people in the neighborhood knew was happening here was that truckers would go there late at night to pick up a prostitute. And so, but what would happen if you changed the ground plane of that area and literally made it like a 24-hour access space where during the day, there was like farmers markets, and entries to different stores and schools nearby, or in the evening, there was actually a dock where some manufacturing happened. So there were things going on there. Good uses do drive out bad uses. So these were the kind of things that we wanted to do. And so the idea here was in our minds was not that this 5-acre site was just going to be like this great one spot, and it's this little jewel that sits there, but it was going to raise the bar for the way development was done in this community, and thus give it an example of how to do it elsewhere. And so we assembled a team. So once we got the city to realize that site should be used for something like that, we of course went to work, and we assembled this amazing team with some of the most fantastic developers of all types in the city. We actually had a Habitat for Humanity in New York who was planning on building 100 units of low-income home ownership. A great supportive housing company was planning on doing integrated housing for kids aging out of foster care with services associated with it. And we also were going to have like seriously beautiful rooftop or high top places for folks that actually could afford to spend a lot of money on their apartments as well. And last but definitely not least, we had 200,000 square feet of commercial, manufacturing, cultural, educational space. But the piece that was most exciting to me was the 90,000 square feet that was reserved specifically for manufacturing and light manufacturing, because we knew that that's where the most jobs were, that's where the most demand was, and that is literally what would create the kind of really healthy ecosystem of both housing and commercial and activity in the community. So we were super excited about it, and we also had, our team was possibly one of the most diverse teams that New York City had ever seen, with more minority and women-owned businesses ever, and all of us top notch. But our city decided instead to kind of take the route that they know best in low-status communities, and they decided to build a low-income housing center there with more community centers and health centers than actual job creation space reserved for it. And it's kind of like, okay, I get it. But anyway, but we're still working. We've got a bunch of other projects in the hopper, but it really did, when that happened, after I kind of dusted myself off, I realized, like, wow, it reminded me of Dr. King's this letter from a Birmingham jail, and so I go back to this a lot. So if you haven't read that letter, it's when Dr. King was, he'd been arrested, he was literally sitting in a Birmingham jail, and there was a letter, an open letter to, that came from a bunch of white ministers, that they published in the paper that said basically, we love you, Dr. King, and appreciate you, fellow Christian, but dude, you have to stop on this integration thing. It's just not time. And the letter is amazing, and it's a quick read, but this quote really stuck out to me because, I hope, sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience. If you have lived in a low-status community and you feel like on a real level and see the impact of years and years and decades of entrenched poverty, and of assuming that poverty is a cultural attribute, what you realize is that when you codify low expectations, you actually entrench them in people, in community, and you continue to do that, then you have a bit of a problem. And we're seeing it right now, that even after all, that we haven't really focused much more, I'm sorry, think about it. Where was Dr. King when he died? He was in Memphis, literally working with the black sanitation workers who were fighting very simply for their economic rights and for their environmental rights, because even though they did the same work and sometimes worse work than their fellow white sanitation workers, they would often get paid less and put in much more environmentally precarious positions. So again, there was not just a racial justice fight, it was for economic justice as well as environmental justice. So if you think about it that way, we can't afford to not be impatient. But if you look at what happened since then, we haven't really pushed very hard on the economic side. And because of that, we're still dealing with the fact that black male unemployment has been rising every year since the passage of most civil rights legislation, most of which would not include economic legislation. And we're not seeing lots of things happen. And honestly, it's not just in the black community or the Latino community, it's also in poor white communities too. And so if we are really thinking about how do we develop and create models for advancement in low-status communities of any color in our country, then we really have to pay more attention to how we do it. Because the bottom line is, what are we doing in the future? Are we wanting to build, continue to build tributes to our collective failures? Or are we going to go forward and build monuments to hope and possibility for the future that is yet to come? Thank you. So we've got 16 minutes for questions. And so I see one gentleman in the red with a microphone. Yeah, that's you. Okay. So how do you want to do? Are folks going to come to you, or? Oh, and you've got a microphone too. Okay.
Oh, very good presentation, and I have a question regarding development. It appears that a lot of the development you talked about was indigenous people like yourself starting up development enterprises, which is great.
Could you put it closer to your mouth, please? Yeah.
Indigenous development as opposed to outside development, and I was wondering about the celebrity side. Have you had support from celebrities that came from, like, Bronx? I was thinking of J-Lo or somebody like that who said, let me help you out, would you welcome that? And what do you think about that as opposed to indigenous development? What's the difference and pro and con?
My first projects were actually with some outside capital. You know, they were joint ventures. I mean, I was for all intents and purposes, the indigenous folks in it. But what we'll find is that, yeah, you will absolutely need partners. And yeah, I mean, if you know of anybody from the Bronx who wants to work with the homegirl who actually has really incredible vision, absolutely, please send them on. Yeah, totally. It's all about the vision and being mindful of what that means. Yep, being a part of it.
Thank you for a very inspiring.
Who's talking?
Yeah.
Oh, hi, thank you.
Thank you for a very inspiring talk. I'm wondering whether you would share a little bit more about team building in the early stages. I know you just said that you had difficulty raising or with people near you, but could you talk a little bit more at sort of a hands-on level about building a team in a way that might help some young people here?
What type of team are you referring to? Because there's many different levels.
To enact a vision from early on. You mentioned the grant, getting a grant, but after that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm going to take team broadly there in terms of
Okay.
actually how it impacted the vision. So I'll start there. And then I could talk a little bit about building the actual team who is actually going to do the implementation, because they're almost never the same people. I wish at some point they will be, but right now they are not.
Could I clarify just
Sure.
a bit? So at a real practical level, if a young person says, I want to do something in my neighborhood, but I can't do it alone,
Nope.
what would they do next?
Okay, so I'll start with, because you don't do anything alone. I mean, you get your coffee, you don't get it by yourself. There's like a horde, like people around the world who get it to your plate. So yes, that is true. Nobody does anything by themselves. However, as far as like going through getting a vision or even having one and making sure that it makes sense, what we did, because again, I got the vision. That's not a problem. But there's a what do you call it? A person up there who's got you. I think you see that. He'll see you. Don't worry. So we did literally dozens of focus groups, hundreds of surveys, just to basically get the ideas out there to make sure that we understood what people's hopes and dreams and aspirations were. So if nothing else, people felt as though they contributed a little bit to like how some of the visions that you saw in this presentation played out. And so then there were definitely folks who wanted to be more closely aligned to what actually went. So they were actually part of an advisory board that we worked with again, and so that they held us accountable to make sure that the visions that we were presenting actually were in line with community vision. As far as building the kind of team who was going to do the actual, whether it was design and then, constructing the actual processes, then that was related to whether, what they actually were able to bring to the table to help make it happen. So if we were talking about building a tech company, I had to have people on my team who actually had that bit of a background, so that we knew that the service that we were pitching to clients, so that they would then in turn be able to pay us to do the work, it had to be someone who knew what they were doing, and who had that level of experience. And for someone who wants to actually get involved in whether it's real estate or any kind of social enterprise, it really is about building your team and understanding what you need. Because if you don't, and believe me, I've made enough mistakes this way, sort of like thinking that I knew, but building a team in terms of understanding what your end game is, and then, frankly, paying whatever the absolute best you can in order to get what you need. And sometimes the paying the best you can isn't necessarily money. It isn't. I mean, believe me, I've had people, as part, like to do the team building for the former juvenile detention facility and developing that project to get people to work with me. I didn't pay them a dime. But what they were interested in doing was actually being a part of a vision that big, so that they could bring their best efforts to it. So we all lost money actually working on that because it didn't go through. But that was what was so exciting, was that it was a vision that was big enough that people felt like, I want to be a part of it. And so just being, and sticking to your guns about what you want to build, and not being afraid to share what it is, and then also not being afraid, to to listen to, because someone else might have a better way of actually executing it as well. Like that, it's a really interesting space to be in, but it's a good one, and it can be really fun. Okay.
I guess I'm a member of the tech community. I'm studying for computer science. And I was really interested and inspired by your topic of promoting diversity in the tech community. What are some specific ways as a student and overall a member of tech and computer science to promote diversity?
Yeah, I mean, the way that we did it, we did a very market-based approach because, and I totally appreciate that, because I feel like, folks that are in the tech sector themselves, I mean, they're people who just want to see it flourish in a really good way and do it in a way that actually reflects what America actually is. And so I really appreciate that. But I think the harder part is actually coming up with which is why we went directly to how can we create a service that then makes it so that the young people that we're working with from our communities don't, because there's all sorts of like really kind of, I think, sort of sometimes unrealistic expectations on the part of people who want to do well, and then also on the part of the young people who want to get into the business. And so that's why we took the hiring out of the equation. That is literally why we built a business that provided a service to a client, so that no one would feel like, oh my gosh, if I say anything wrong, to this kid, they're going to feel guilty. And it was just like, look, it's a product. We have a service that we want to sell you. Let's just make sure it's good. And we want you to meet our team members, because this could be a future team member of yours, literally. And so I think just thinking about, on your own, if you're still a student here, are there ways so that MSU in and of itself could actually be connected to the local community that's out here, so that there would be ways to actually have those kind of, obviously they're orchestrated interactions with local communities around, but is there a way for them to make it so that you're sharing like what's going on like in the tech space? Are there opportunities like that? And I think that's real, so that folks can know, like, this is a way that you could see what's going on in the tech world in a very loose way, but still it's a light touch, but it shows that people are actually paying attention to what's happening outside the walls of the university itself. Okay.
Apropos of what you were saying about getting a teamwork.
Wait, could you start over again? I just heard a whoosh.
A very good place to start is with AmeriCorps. They are doing fantastic jobs around our country. And if you get involved with them, they give you the experience in getting started as a team. And then in your own neighborhood, in your own area, for you to go ahead and pursue then with those that you've already encountered in your process. Also, if a person is going further away, like Peace Corps, and our son did that, amazing things are possible. And so, yes, we can do it. And this involves older people as well as younger people. In fact, some of the older people have some of the experience and some of the knowing of who is who and who to go to.
Yes.
And then with the students, they're great because they have the spark and the energy. And I hope that the people here at this conference who have been enjoying your speech will think about how they can get involved. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. One of your questions earlier answered my question, but I had another one. You've been a part of some amazing work and transformation of neighborhoods and space in the Northeast area, and I see that you're wanting to scale that work across the country. Tell me, are there some spaces or documentation that kind of talks about your journey, your projects that you've worked on, the transformation of areas that someone who wanted to model after some of the work and vision that you're doing could access?
I am my own worst spokesmodel, because I know that there's plenty of stuff and I should probably get it out there. Just in terms of, because there are definitely case studies, some are better than others, but I don't know exactly where to point. I should probably, some of it's actually probably on my website, majorcartergroup.com. good, decent articles, and and my work is studied in schools around the country, which is really nice. But I've actually never sat in on any of the classes, so I don't really know how they do it. But I have heard from a lot of young people that they've learned from my example in a college setting, which is deeply humbling and exciting. But yeah, and then also we actually, this is my job now. I actually consult around the country as well. And so hopefully I'm going to be not in Missouri, but there's been a number of southeastern cities that have, especially around the tech work, have taken a very serious interest in how to expand the tech ecosystem in their cities, because everybody's got one. I mean, it's really fascinating. That it's this huge driver, but like American tech diversity, people are seeing that it's not taking the low status communities with it, and people are starting to recognize like this might be one way, not the only way, certainly not a silver bullet, but an approach that no one's really tried before, and that has actually shown some success that they want to see more of. Yeah. Okay. Oh.
Hi, just kind of like a little bit of curiosity. I was really interested in the idea of mixed income housing, but I really don't know too much about it. And so I was just kind of wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about
Sure.
it some more, and also just kind of wondering how would that, like, if you have people on both ends of the spectrum living together, how does that not increase prices in like coffee shops and bookstores and that kind of stuff?
Well, I'll take the second part first. And so, and specifically, I'm working in low status communities, and that's the approach where I'm going to, just geographically want to understand that, because even though there actually is a lot, like much of the housing policy was about actually getting more mixed income housing in what they call high opportunity areas, which are like wealthier areas, but rich people are notorious for not wanting anybody else in their communities, frankly. I mean, I think we can agree on that. And so that's been stalled. So our approach is like, listen, we know that low status communities actually produce lots of great talent, but it's encouraged to leave. And what if we created an approach that actually said, let's try to retain some of that talent in our own communities, right? So that's where I'm starting from. And but because in those same communities, we know the cost of doing nothing, which is basically what happens when we continue to do real estate development that continues to concentrate poverty. People do get sicker. Their health outcomes are worse. Their educational outcomes are worse. Their economic prospects are worse. We know that to be the case. And so, but we also know, and there have been plenty of studies out there that show that more economically diverse communities, from Israel to this country to all over the world, they're the ones that are actually more stable in every sense of the word. In every sense of the word, in terms of general quality of life, crime rates, all of that stuff. And so it's like, since we know that, why wouldn't we try to do something that's a little bit different? And also, and I hear often from folks, it's like, if you work on making a neighborhood a lot better, aren't you afraid of displacing, poor people? No, I'm not, because quite frankly, poor people get displaced all the time, and usually they're replaced by other poor people. But that's not an issue to most people at all. But with our approach, there actually is an opportunity for folks in the lowest end of the economic spectrum to actually become less poor. That's what I'm more interested in doing. That's why we make such an emphasis on what are the economic drivers and building them into our developments. That's what we do. That's why the project that I ended with is such a failure to me, because it's like, great, we've got another community center for poor people. That sounded really harsh, didn't it? But basically, that is what we have in low status communities. Again, I don't know anybody who's been able to move out because their economic status changed to another place that had more community centers. That's not what anybody does. And yet, that's what developers build in poor neighborhoods. Like, oh, they need another community center. No, we really don't. We need jobs. We need business development. We need access for people that are in those communities to own some of those businesses. and build some of that housing even. And that would be transformative. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.